time value of money. Right. Somebody's raised their hands. Yeah, somebody's raised their hands. What's up? Harsh had raised your hand. Would you want to speak? Is there something, or can I continue?
Maybe because of by mistake, it maybe you can continue.
Okay, sorry. All right. Cool. So now, so as I said, banks, financial institutions, or anybody who's owed debt that has the commercial effect of borrowing, and the debt is given as against time value of money. So banks and financial institutions becomes clear. For example, say banks would be ICICI, SBI, Kotak. Financial institutions would be, say, Piramal Enterprises, IDBI Trusteeship Limited, JM FARC. So as in the financial asset reconstruction companies. So a gamut of banks and financial institutions can make an application for resolution of the debts of a corporate debtor if they had granted loans to such corporate debtor. More so that anybody else whose loan has the qualities which includes when that in the qualities such as money was disbursed and is payable back after a length of time, and during that duration of time between lending and getting back, so certain conditions are payable which give that which sort of have an interest like structure. I may caution you that interest is not the only indicator of what is time value of money. There could be other returns that may be payable to, say, a lender that will indicate whether the lending was such that it had a time value of money. I don't want you guys to get complicated or overwhelmed by what is commercial effect of borrowing and time value of money. Mostly these questions are clear except in certain exceptional cases such as real estate developers, where I may add that this answer is still not, we don't still have a very clear answer as to why they've been called financial creditors, or a money paid in lieu of a real estate allotment is called financial debt, frankly. Anyway, so what happens? They file. There's also a third category called corporate applicant. That means I, as a corporate, may file an application and say that I have not been able to resolve my debts and I need to go under CII process for the same, and a committee of creditors needs to be formed. The criteria for these different kind of creditors is different. For an operational creditor, the criteria is proper documentation. I guess that's the criteria for everybody. More importantly, that there should be no dispute between the creditor and the debtor. I will go into that later. For a financial creditor, the financial creditor, the threshold is fairly low. The bank or the financial institution may just have to show, okay, this was the debt owed to us, it exceeds the threshold, which was 1 lakh previously and 1 crore now, and that's about it. Corporate applicant will also have to meet the same threshold. Corporate applicant will also have to, sure. Somebody's asked me, will outsourced companies will be considered as an operational creditor? Yes, if I may allow you to speak, and I don't understand what outsourced companies mean. So if I could, perhaps if you could speak up, I don't know how you'll do that. Do you mean a foreign company? Is that what you mean?
Ma'am, if you want to unmute him, you can go to participants and then select yes and then unmute.
Sure, this is not made for my generation. I'm unable to unmute him for some reason. Sure. Now it's no, yeah, cool. Go ahead, Yash.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, so outsourced companies means those companies, some type of work which is not mainstream work of the company is given to those company who are specialized in those type of businesses.
Sure. You mean contractors, perhaps?
Yeah.
So what is your question? Can I file a CI process against them, a contractor? Is that your question?
No, can I be considered as an operational creditor?
For sure, depending on the, so it doesn't matter what your relationship with your company is. It will, even if you're a related party, you can still file, though that will have another set of complications and connotations. But say, for example, I'll give you an example. Then you tell me if it fits in your idea of outsourcing of work. Say I have been given the contract to construct a bridge. I'm L&T. I will get 2 more constructors who are local and contract them out, subcontract out the work to them. Is your question that if I subcontract the work to them and I don't pay them, can they file against me? Is that your question?
Yes.
Of course they can. A large number of OC debts, in fact, begin with these construction-related debts. As long as you provided me goods and services and I've not paid you back, and you can prove so, and you can file in whatever form, you're eligible to file for sure.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Cool. Now, corporate, as I was saying, corporate applicant will have a separate set of criteria. The biggest criteria for a corporate applicant is that he should show that there was no debt that was pending for the past 3 years, that was immediately pending, or if it is pending, then the shareholders and directors will have to certify that we will clear these debts as soon as possible. I'll tell you why such a criteria exists for corporate applicant. This is sort of comes from the learnings of the SICA. When under the SICA, a moratorium would apply immediately after the board admitted your reference of your as a SIC company, and a lot of people started going with their company's reference to just obtain the benefit of a moratorium. For the uninitiated, moratorium means it means like a complete stoppage of litigation against you and your resources, which is obviously beneficial for anybody who's been sort of defaulting on their payments. So to prevent the happening of such an event, corporate applicants have to give certain affidavits and undertakings to prove that they're not doing so just to take the benefit of a moratorium. Right. Now, say all these applications are filed and all that any of these applicants file an application before the concerned NCLT. I also would like you to know that there is NCLTs per jurisdiction, per state. And while for example, I'll give you an example between how jurisdiction is different when you initiate a recovery proceeding as opposed to an insolvency proceeding. For example, you try and initiate a recovery proceeding through the CPC or the Recovery of Debts Act. You prove cause of action either where one of the plaintiff resides, or one of the defendants resides, or where part of cause of action resides. So say I have given a loan to a company, I am in Delhi, I have rather taken a loan from a company in Hyderabad, and there's an intermediary, say in Pune, who's handling the documentation. If some mess up happens because the person in Pune and I'm not able to pay back, then cause of action can arise if the amount is high enough in Bombay as well, in the Mumbai High Court as well, right? Or the Pune bench of the Bombay High Court. In the event now, so that's why the problem that's one of the lacuna that existed in the previous recovery mechanism. Since even if a part of a cause of action arose in any part of the country, a litigant would get a right to sue there, irrespective of where the defendant resides. Sorry. Now, with the NCLTs coming into force, it's become simple. Wherever the corporate debtor resides, the NCLT in charge of that jurisdiction, that's where the cause of action will lie. For example, though NCLT Cuttack has come into play now since last year, all Kolkata and all West Bengal and Odisha based applications were going to NCLT CAL. Subsequently, NCLT Odisha came, and those applications which were pending with NCLT CAL were transferred, and any subsequent cause of action that arises in Odisha goes to NCLT Cuttack. Right. Anyway, so you file, say, in the relevant NCLT. The question that comes up then is, okay, you were able to overcome the hurdles of filing procedure. IBC, if I may say, is very, very procedural in nature. It's very performer heavy. It's completely dependent on the documentation and the form you filled. I guess because when you're trying to resolve debts, the first thing that you have to do is, and if you want to do it by like a time-bound mechanism where judges are not going into too much inquiry of the debt default and they have summary jurisdiction, they want to ensure that everything is in place for them to give a decision. That's the reason why it's so documentation and performer heavy. Anyway, now after much back and forth, CIRP initiation will have to happen in 14 days, or reasons have to be given in writing as to why the NCLT has not admitted your application within the 14 days. In my practical experience, I have barely ever seen the 14-day thing happening. Anyway, NCLT, suppose everything goes right in your favor, you've initiated the application, NCLT admits, say, in 14 days, 20 days, whatever. Then that's the day that CIRP gets initiated against that particular corporate debtor. RP is also mostly appointed by that order. Some cases, some NCLTs do, they give you 1 or 2 day gap. And the moratorium against your corporate debtor kicks in from that day. After the IRP is appointed, the IRP has to follow the timeline of the code. Under the code, he is supposed to make a public announcement within 1 day and form the COC within 30 days. Public announcement within 3 days, and COC has to be formed within 30 days. COC comprises completely of financial creditors, unless there's an OC that holds more than 10% of the total debt of the corporate debtor. Say I am, say there are many financial creditors like IDBI, ICICI, SBI, and they hold 80% of the debt, and there's an L&T type which holds like 20%. So all of these will sit on the COC, including L&T. Now post the amendments and litigation of real estate developers, their representative will also sit on the COC. All right. Sorry, this is right. Meanwhile, while now the timeline begins for the RP to collect claims. Now, as you know, one creditor has initiated a CIR process, but insolvency proceedings are in rem proceedings. Doesn't they apply throughout and to all creditors and stakeholders of the corporate debtor? That means other creditors will also now have to file their claim with the IRP. IRP generally gets confirmed as the RP by the COC within their first hearing. That's generally performed unless the COC becomes deeply unhappy with the IRP's performance. Most IRPs are appointed as RPs, as in interim resolution professionals become resolution professionals after the confirmation of their appointment by the COC. Anyway, so RP will now have to, the board of directors of the company gets suspended, RP takes over, all contracts vest in him, all documents and records vest in him. He has to not only on one hand collect claims that other creditors are filing against that corporate debtor, it also has to now start preparing for the next leg, which is a resolution plan. Resolution plans won't come easy. You have to make an expression of interest, asking people to submit a resolution plan for the company, and asking them and giving them a snapshot of the financials of the corporate debtor, and then they will in return say, okay, we are interested in resolution plan, give us documents, you want to do diligence. Generally at this stage, when say if I am somebody who's interested in a company and I think it's coming cheap because of the insolvency resolution process, I'll be like, okay, I'll contact the RP saying I'm interested, give me the information memorandum. The info memo basically is the RP collects all the relevant records of the company, puts them online on something called the VDR, which is like an online room which you can log it into and all the documents there. Aside from the jargon, it's just basically a database. And the RP gives the database to anybody who's interested in the resolution plan process, and they have to pay a fee for access to the same. After that, then the process goes on. Then some people will say, okay, we're submitting a resolution plan. They won't. That's why the public announcement comes into importance. When the initial public announcement is made, RP sets the deadline for 2-3 things. One, response to his call for claims. He'll set a deadline saying, say within 3 months, please give me your claim. And say this is the last date for submission of resolution plans. In practice, this public announcement gets made many times before actually a resolution plan comes into the hands of the RP. Chalo, we are very lucky and some resolution plan does come into the hands of the RP. Then what does he do? He has to go to the COC and say, this is the resolution plan. These are the resolution plans that have come. Now, post the latest decisions, there's a lot of apprehension as to the plan approval process and who's applying and what are the intentions and what is the relationship with the company. There was an initial case called the Synergies Dure case, where Synergies Dure Automotive was the first ever resolution plan that was approved under the IBC. I was lucky enough to watch the hearing as well. When this plan happened, a problem that arose was that the resolution plan applicant, as the person who was applying to procure the company post the resolution plan process, and one of the creditors, it was alleged that they have certain related party relations between them, or there was some related party connection between them. To avoid this hurdle, and so this is one kind of experience that the insolvency regulator was facing. I must say that the IBC has evolved so greatly because the insolvency regulator has been very, very quick and on their feet, and they've reacted to challenges supremely fast. So when some certain related party issues were seen, and also that was the time, this was August 2017, where Essar Steel's insolvency was initiated. Okay, sorry, somebody has raised their hand. Somebody's asked me, will the creditors participate in making the resolution plan, or just the approval by the creditors? I will get to that. Good question. But they can make substantive changes. So, the answer to your question is, resolution applicants can give a plan. RP does, where I was getting to was RP does an initial check on the 29A. I was giving you the origins of 29A. And then after the 29A, COC will also have to give a final pronouncement on whether this is come by a promoter. For anybody who's to the uninitiated, 29A is a reference to provision in the IBC, which prohibits promoters and anybody who's had certain criteria that they make him unfit for applying for a resolution plan. They're not allowed to apply. Unfit for applying means it could be somebody who's given guarantees to a corporate debtor and they don't get and has not fallen through, or has had an account which is an NPA for a year. So stuff like that. This was generally done to discourage promoters who run down the company from applying again for the particular company through the resolution process, because otherwise it doesn't make sense. I ran down the company, it goes into resolution for resolution of its debts and for rehabilitation, and then I go and try and get the company through an alternate route. To avoid this, and because of the learnings we had from Synergies Dure and possible bidding for Essar Steel, Arun Jaitley made an announcement that they were going to amend the IBC to provide to secure a company from falling into the hands of the same people who ran it down. Now coming back to Aryan's question, he's asked, hey, in case the creditor is left out of CIRP for any reason and the CIRP is completed, can they later initiate another CIRP if debt owed to them exceeds the threshold, or do they have to necessarily go for another remedy? Also, what if a member of the COC is not satisfied with how things are going and he wants to withdraw from the CIRP and seek his individual remedy? In response to that, I must make you look at section 11 of the code. Certain persons are not entitled to. So first part of your application is, one, if CIR, I'm going to break it down. One, if CIR process has been initiated in respect of a company, by some creditors and somebody gets left out, can they initiate CIR process again after it's been done? That's part one of your question. Second part of your question is, can they pull out of the COC pool and say, I want to deal with it later? Now, for first part of your question, I must read out section 11 of the IBC. It says persons not entitled to make an application. The following persons are not entitled to make an application to initiate CIR process, namely, A corporate debtor undergoing the CIR process, or a corporate debtor having completed CIR process 12 months preceding the date of the application, or a corporate debtor in respect of whom a liquidation order has been made. There is no particular bar against persons undergoing so there's no particular prohibition against somebody undergoing a CIR process, having undergone a CIR process to undergo a CIR process again. So generally, it's preferred that the particular creditor file with the rest of the creditors. That's one. I have not seen them file another CIRP. because generally a company that's been under CIRP and has been acquired under resolution plan or under liquidation, it's very tough that they'll not pay back their debts. Also, if a member of the COC is not satisfied with how the things are going and he wants to withdraw from the CIRP and seek his individual remedy, he can't do that if the company is in CIR process. I mean, he can do that and perhaps sue the company later when it gets acquired into a resolution plan and becomes some other company. But, or he can wait for it to go into a liquidation, and in liquidation, you're allowed to pull out of the liquidation pool. I hope that answers the question, Aryan. If there's a doubt, please ask me. Somebody else has asked me what exactly happened in Synergy's Dure case and how did it impact IBC. As I just said, one second. All right. As I just said, Synergy's okay. What happened in Synergy's Dure case was it had another sister company that had assigned its loan to another company called Millennium Finance, which had become a part of the COC. So there were allegations that there was a member of the COC who had sort of relationship with the corporate debtor, and was not ultimately, and that's not allowed. You can't sit on the COC and have a corporate relationship with the creditor. In fact, there's a particular bar in the section 21 itself which prevents the related party person from sitting on the COC. And another related party was trying to apply for Synergy's Dure. So the COC, the corporate debtor, and the resolution applicant had relationships, which sort of gave the regulator an idea that maybe it's not the best, and maybe it's not the best thought to allow somebody who's had a relationship with the corporate debtor to apply again in the CIR process, right? And your answer is as in what changes did the case result in? As I just said, it led to the introduction of something called the 29A. An amendment was made to the code after section 29 to introduce something called the 29A. It created specific stipulations as to who cannot apply for a resolution plan. Includes largely used to ban promoters or anybody who's a related party, anybody who's given a guarantee, anybody whose account has been in NPA for the past year. Though post ArcelorMittal, that case that happened in 2019 in October, anybody who's had an NPA can remove the NPA. NPA means a non-performing asset, a company that is an account that has not been serviced for say so many days and plus has become an NPA plus 90 days. So if a certain time has passed, and an account becomes NPA, you will not be allowed to bid for a company under the IBC unless you service your debts. Aryans against asked, yes, thanks. The remedy a creditor dropping out of the COC would be through a regular civil suit for recovery after the moratorium gets over. Remember that after moratorium gets over, which is when either a company is into liquidation, or liquidation also has some version of a moratorium though, or when the company gets bought by another company and you file a recovery suit against the new resolved company. I hope that answers the question, Aryan. I hope I've answered your question, Yashasvi. Creditors do participate in making the resolution plan and they approve the thing as well. They are allowed to make constructive contributions to the resolution plan, and generally resolution applicants accept those. Okay. Somebody else asked me a question. Okay, so Ashna wants to talk. Okay, yeah. Yeah, Ashna.
Hey, no, sorry, I didn't press anything. I don't know exactly what happened.
Sorry. Anybody else? Right. Moving on. Except not moving on. Okay, cool. All right. As I was saying, two major factors resulting in the introduction of 29A. Anyway, after say a plan clears the process, it meets the check of it being filed, having been filed by eligible persons. COC also makes additions, subtractions, and allows the plan to pass to the adjudicating authority. Adjudicating authority, we look at certain criteria, and its role has been completely circumscribed now post many decisions and the amendment of the code last year. It will look at whether it complies with the law, whether the operational creditors have been given the minimum due in terms of the code, and generally will allow the plan. Generally, that's the mandate it's been given. Should it not meet the muster of the IBC, the liquidation order will be granted. Now the COC has also been granted the power to just file a resolution with 66% vote saying that we don't think this company is going anywhere, let's liquidate. Which is good because some companies are just fairly asset heavy and actually have no chance of being bought out or being resolved. Right? When a company goes into liquidation, the liquidator gets appointed. Most RPs continue as liquidators. They will do the first thing they will do is they'll make a liquidation estate, as in collect all the properties of a corporate debtor, collect them and make a liquidation estate. It's important because liquidation, unlike CRP, is still supposed to get completed in 2 years. So he's in charge of running the company for 2 years. In this time, he'll do the best to acquire more and more assets, use certain assets to run the company. There's a lot of litigation this time. Just to and now, since you're allowed to do a restructuring or like file a scheme to rescue a company, he will try his best to procure offers to ensure that the company can pass on as a going concern. In fact, now that's been the dictate of the NCLAT as well. If a company goes into liquidation, that's the first thing that the liquidator should try to ensure that a company can be sold off as is to anybody who's willing to buy. Better highlight from the Supreme Court in this regard has been that initially the diktat was that there's something called liquidation value. Say if I am a company and I have good assets, I'll have a high liquidation value. That means if I sell my assets, I'll be able to get more money. I may have a low liquidation value if I'm not asset heavy and somebody will not. If all my assets are sold, I'll get some peanuts. Initially, there was this view that at least the creditors, at least anybody who's bidding for a company, say under a resolution plan, should at least provide minimum they should provide is a liquidation value. Though I may admit for some companies the liquidation value is 0. So a lot of people were able to circumvent that hurdle through that. Now the Supreme Court has said, no, we can't go into liquidation value, whether it meets minimum liquidation value or not. As long as somebody is buying the company out and they're able to rehabilitate the company, go ahead. It's all good. Liquidation completes in 2 years. Towards the end of liquidation, there's something called the waterfall mechanism, where the creditors have been placed in hierarchy. I'm trying to not emphasize on the waterfall too much, though I will admit that the ultimate aim behind IBC is to ensure that you're higher up on the waterfall. The waterfall means that imagine a stack of creditors and they are supposed to get paid in terms of the proceeds of the company. Higher up, you get the maximum amount in the waterfall. Lower in the hierarchy, you get the least amount in the waterfall. Financial creditors, secure financial creditors are top of the list. They've given security. They deserve some higher amounts of security that was given to the corporate debtor. Lowest are workmen. Lowest are unsecured creditors, operational creditors, crown debts, as in debts owed to the government. They are on the lower end. Right. And when the final dissolution of assets happens as per this hierarchy, liquidation is over and dissolution has happened. Chapter closed. I am now seeking to move on because I've spent a fair amount of time on explanation of the IBC. I'm hoping that this has been okayishly clear and I can perhaps move on. Okay. Now, where were we? We were at, I had discussed what constitutes financial debt and what the final word on financial debt was. Time value of money, commercial effect of borrowing, does not include third-party mortgages, but includes real estate debt. All right. I also shown you guys the form for financial creditors and operational creditors as to what is to be applied. I stress again and again, IBC is nothing if you can't comply to the strictures of the form. All right. Now, somebody's asked me what happens if the resolution plan is not approved. If the resolution plan is not approved by the NCLT, the company goes into liquidation. That's the difference between this law and any other law. The Recovery of Debts Act also had a 180-day period within which the recovery of debts had to happen, but it prescribed no consequence for that not happening. That is the most this diktat of the code, that resolution else liquidation is the most defining feature of the IBC, perhaps. All right. Now, I want to talk about Innoventive Industries a little bit. It was the first ever admission of insolvency under the IBC. happened fairly early, 17 Jan 2017, and as you know, IBC was in force only on 1st December 2016. Innovative Industry, ICICI Bank led this litigation, filed an application against Innovative Industries under Section 7. ICICI Bank, being the bank, was owed financial debt and filed against Innovative Industries. Innovative Industries is a multiple product supplier type company. It, by the way, also since it was in Maharashtra, falls within the jurisdiction of the Maharashtra Undertakings Act. Maharashtra Undertakings Act was like a relic of the SICA applicable to Maharashtra and had its own moratorium period. And Innovative Industries was, in its debt situation, was such that the moratorium under the Maharashtra Undertakings Act was applicable to Innovative. And that's what it claimed, saying, boss, IBC does not apply to us because we are anyway under moratorium under the special Maharashtra law. And while after NCLT admission happened, Innovative appealed in NCLAT and then in Supreme Court. Innovative is not only landmark in terms of what it holds for applications by FCs, but also clarified this thing at the very outset that the IBC is the complete code. And IBC being later in time will, and if in the event of a repugnancy, IBC will prevail. So if Maharashtra Undertaking Act says that you can't, no insolvency lies against a company under a specific moratorium imposed under that Maharashtra Undertaking Act, and then there's the IBC which gives the creditors the right to file if there's debt owed, there's a clear repugnancy or difference in which case IBC prevails. IBC, by the way, is also later in time. That act was somewhere in. I hope you know that in case of two contrasting laws, the special law prevails over the general law, and in case of two special laws, the later in time one will prevail. So that's one importance of why Innovative Industries is landmark. Second is also because this was the first time that Justice Nariman totally spelled out the contours of the IBC. It also made apparent the distinction between FCs, which is financial creditors, and operational creditors. It said only the following things need to be looked at while admitting an application filed by a financial creditor under Section 7 of the code. 1, it should be filed in the prescribed format. Second, all you need to see is that the default threshold should be crossed, which was 1 lakh then and 1 crore now. I think I've done a slide to this effect as well. You know that the IBC has not been amended, right, for the threshold. Only a notification has been issued by the MCA under the powers given to them under Section 4. You have to perhaps appreciate the foresight of the lawmakers who envisaged perhaps there could be situations where the IBC will not be that effective or maybe harmful to corporate debtors, and it provided the executive the power to issue a notification to change the threshold in such times. And that's what the executive has done. It's issued a notification which has come into force, which now has changed the threshold. The good part about such a power is that this can happen fast. Notifications can be rolled out by executive faster than, say, an ordinance being passed or a law being passed. So that's that. Third is there is no need for demand notice. Innovative Industries, by the way, claimed against ICICI that you had not issued us a proper legal notice, and therefore we should not. This insolvency proceeding should not be commenced against us. Now, as I will go on to explain to you, or if you probably know, in the case of an operational creditor, there's a demand notice which is of extreme importance. So there is no concomitant or corresponding requirement for a financial creditor under the IBC, right? In such a case, if there is no such legislative requirement given, Justice Nariman held that there is no need for a demand notice or a legal notice for a financial creditor, that is a bank or a financial institution filing a Section 7 application. Similarly, as is in the case of an operational creditor, there is no need to look into whether the debt was in fact disputed or not. As I will go on to explain, or if you know, disputes regarding a debt can prove fatal to an application filed by an operational creditor. As in, if there are disputes regarding the quality, pricing, or breach of a representation or warranty in a contract, that's enough. If shown to the tribunal will chuck the IBC application out if it's an operational creditor. Operational creditor meaning somebody who's provided goods and services and not been paid back money. But that similar inquiry is not supposed to be done for a Section 7 application filed by a financial creditor. This spelled out the contours of what would define IBC application for financial creditors over years. This law is so sacrosanct that even that now we know that the threshold for admission for financial creditor application is very, very low. You barely have to demonstrate a thing or two, and that is it. This was perhaps done because the whole aim behind IBC was to inculcate discipline amongst those who are taking loans from banks and financial institutions, especially public banks and financial institutions, which are reservoirs or custodians of public money. All right. I hope this is clear, so I'm going to move on. All right. The test for operational creditors was laid down in Mobilox versus Kirusa. Now, what happened was after the provision Section 9 came into force, there's this landmark case that happened, which revolved around the most infamous show across this world called Nach Baliye. I put in a video also, just a video. I'm not sure if you should watch that or not. It's boring. But what happened was Mobilox. Okay, I'll play it if you guys want to watch it. Watch it.
हमारे यहाँ पर एक और कोल्ड.
Right. I'm gonna still keep speaking after this. This great show led to what was the greater, what was basically landmark principles of what is operational debt and what proves fatal to an operational creditor application. What happened was that Mobilox Innovations was in charge of collecting the votes after the end of each episode to provide for who gets eliminated next. Now, I think this is enough. I don't know if you guys know the format of Nach Baliye or not. I have been watching it since time immemorial. The format of this show is that each person does a does like this performance, and at the end of the day, the loser gets out. And a part of the assessment of their dance performance comes from voting by the audience. The voting by audience happens through this televoting helpline, where people have to call and say, I vote for XYZ couple. And that eventually those votes get counted and eventually play into the final result of who wins, who loses. Wow, one sec, sorry. Ajitesh has asked me, can OCs put claims for disputed debt to RP? Very good question. Yes, you can. The very definition of claims includes claims can be disputed, debt can't be. That's the difference. So OCs, while filing, will not be allowed to initiate a CIR process based on disputed claim, but will be allowed to do so with after the initiation of a CIR process, if you're just filing a claim with the RP. I would request also people could wait for asking this question when I finish the train of thought. I'm just at the beginning. Right. So what happened in Mobilox was Mobilox Innovations was in charge of collecting these televotes to eventually provide to Star TV the results of each round or whatever. Now it subcontracted its services to Kirusa Software. They were in charge of setting up helplines, these telephone lines which would get called, and then assessing of votes and collation of votes and providing it to Mobilox. This was one set of contract where Kirusa would perform the services Mobilox would provide these services and Mobilox would raise an invoice on Kirusa. Kirusa also had signed an NDA, which is a non-disclosure agreement with Mobilox, saying that they would not advertise who they're doing what for, because this was a famous program. Kirusa failed to respond to the invoices and didn't pay any money. Now, they also, by the way, on a separate platform, advertise that they're working for the famous Star TV show called Nach Baliye. Mobilox sues them for breach of NDA by sending them a notice saying, bro, you were not supposed to say this on like publicly. So you breached the NDA and there are damages. Kirusa, meanwhile, sends invoices to Mobilox saying you haven't paid us this money for all that counting and all that jazz that we've done for you. Kirusa moves a Section 9 applications, NCLT Maharashtra. NCLT Maharashtra says, okay, disputes have been defined as any dispute, any suit or arbitration that is pending between parties. I will read suit or arbitration expansively to include dispute, includes suit or arbitration or anything else. So dispute also could mean any pending dispute which may have not reached court but is still brewing between the parties. And NCLT Bombay says, okay, we cannot include, you already have a dispute pending relating to the non-disclosure agreement. They have a problem against you, you have a problem against them. Please sort it out outside this. NCLAT took a very strict view, restrictive view of what is a dispute. So dispute can only be a suit or an arbitration and cannot mean any pre-existing dispute certified by or reflected in the correspondence. Mobilox had nothing doing, we're moving to Supreme Court. Supreme Court then, like Mobilox is the innovative for operational creditors. It laid down the following. One, a Section 8 demand notice has to be sent in the prescribed format, and that's an absolute essential for initiating CIR process under the IBC. You don't send in the prescribed format, you cannot initiate CIR process. There's an alternative, by the way, to initiating the CIP for operational creditors, which is a Form 4. That's not exactly like a demand notice, but it is a demand notice where you don't have invoices, but you can give like whatever documents you have and file those instead. I'll go further into why that alternative form of demand notice is important, but more on that later. What happens is demand notice, once an operational creditor issues it to the corporate debtor, irrespective of a 10-day, irrespective of a reply or not, within 10 days gives the right to the operational creditor to sue as an initiate the CIR process application. Now, again, moving back to the CIR process application, that also has to be in the right format and absolutely right documentation. I would actually like to show you the CIR process application. Right. So as I said, there was a Form 3, which is the demand notice format. This is what a demand notice looks like. You give a covering letter with the name and address of the corporate debtor, registered office of the OC. You give total amount of debt, amount claimed to be default. The total amount of debt can be, say, 2 crores, but as per the invoices, say only 1 crore is due and payable right now. So that will be the total amount in default. Security held, I've seen very few operational debts have security. Generally, security, which means there's a mortgage or a hypothecation securing your loan. I've seen that mostly in financial creditors. Very few times have I seen hypothecation of goods. But anyways, if your operational debt is such that there are goods involved, you please mention them here. Details of retention of title arrangements in respect of any goods to which the operational debt refers. This retention of title arrangements means that sometimes some goods are retained back for not payment, and some OCs say, there's a backlog of previous payments. I'm going to hold on to these goods till you pay the previous payments to me as well. These are the details of retention of title arrangements of those goods that you'll keep. Say, yeah, we have a contract, we were supposed to supply these. I have not supplied these because the previous debts are unpaid. Record of default to the IUs, as I mentioned previously, IUs are databases that maintain records of your debt. Not so sure if OC debt has proper records. FC debts, I think, are still being maintained properly now in IUs wherever available. This is the same if you provide the provision of law, contract, and other documents. This part is important. This is where the law is played in. It says, if you dispute the existence of or amount of unpaid operational debt, please provide the undersigned within 10 days of the receipt of this letter of the pendency of suit or arbitration proceedings in relation to such dispute filed before the receipt of this letter or notice. This is incredibly important because it says, one, this is you to respond to the notice of dispute. make sure that the dispute arose prior to such demand notice being sent to you. Then if you believe, if the corporate debtor believes that it's already made payments, it should give an attested copy of the record of electronic transfer or any other record, and it's supposed to send this form across in this format with the documentation to the corporate debtor. This form 4 is an alternative to demand notice, in which you can just give your invoice demanding payment and attach saying this, I am so and so, this is the operational creditor, this is the corporate debtor, this is what is owed, and that's it. And this simplistic form is an alternative demand notice. How this plays on and whether you can just send this anytime or not has been explained in future litigations, which I will get back to. All right. Aside from then, suppose you file a demand notice, everything is fine, you receive a reply, you don't receive a reply, you proceed to file a CI process application. Certain things are mandatory now. Mandatory in terms of, it's not that they will be fatal to your application completely, but the tribunal has the power to ask you to change your application and come back within 10 days. So the first thing is an affidavit of no dispute. You may have to be careful here, though most operational creditors just go ahead and provide an affidavit of no dispute, saying that, okay, we know that there's no dispute and I'm saying that in an affidavit. You have to be very careful in doing that, because you know if you lie on an affidavit, there's a punishment prescribed under the IPC for lying on oath. But so you mandatorily provide it and ensure you're not lying on it. Then you need to provide a certificate from bank that no amounts have been received. This is held to be not mandatory in the sense that it will be fatal to your application, but Justice Nariman has called this a very important piece of evidence in determining operational debt. You have to understand that the transaction between OCs, operational creditors, and corporate debtors is such that their day-to-day transactions, running transactions, everyday purchase orders, everyday invoices. Unless there's proof that actually no money was received, in the absence of solid documentation, as which financial creditors keep and operational creditors don't keep, it's important to show your ledger accounts saying that, hey, I actually have not received any money. So, a demand notice, proper format, CI process application after 10 days, in the right format, and affidavit of no dispute and the banker's certificate are essentials for any litigator. You should know your way through these documents. You should be able to advise your clients on these documents. Next. Thank God. All right. This recent litigation that came in NCLAT in 2020 has further expanded on the documentation required. This may seem slightly boring because IBC seems document heavy, but that's about it. That's all. Your diligence in documentation and preparing your forms is what is crucial in IBC, and in how you advise your clients eventually. So now what happened with Flipkart was there was this Cloudwalker Systems that was supplying Flipkart LED TVs, and it claimed that Flipkart had placed its orders pursuant to a supply agreement, and then eventually stopped after placing orders, and after the Cloudwalker company was importing these LED TVs. Flipkart was asking it to keep the TVs inside its warehouses, and eventually, and since the TV load was piling up and Flipkart refused to take the delivery, it started saying that you give it to us at a discounted price, and has eventually not made any payments. Cloudwalker went to NCLT Bangalore. NCLT Bangalore, because Flipkart's registered office is in Bangalore, and filed a Section 9. NCLT Bangalore admitted, saying there is no dispute. Eventually went up to NCLAT. And it's important that Flipkart made these arguments, which have to be, I'm repeating these arguments for your benefit because these are arguments that you may want to make when your client, say, is under a Section 9 code. It said, firstly, it drew attention to the contract. It said, while your allegations are that we didn't accept, you had to keep our product in the warehouse and we didn't accept those, it was basically in the contract that you were in charge of the warehousing and storage. So that is your argument that there was deficiency in service by us, which has led you to make a claim for these damages. The deficiency in service didn't exist. This brings in this is an aspect of the larger argument that debt has to be payable, one, in fact and in law. if the debt does not crystallize, there is no way that a Section 9 application can be maintained. I must say that Mobilox didn't stress on this fact too much, and somehow this fact gets overlooked a lot in OC applications where the entire exercise is about finding out if there's a dispute. Flipkart has taken a progressive step to actually spell out saying if there is no debt crystallized by virtue of the agreement, there is no debt payable in fact or in law. Section 9 cannot lie. Another important point which was highlighted by Flipkart was it said that CloudWalker had not sent it any purchase orders or invoices or any other documentation to support debt. CloudWalker in response said, but I sent you not the demand notice, but that other form of demand notice where I sent you an invoice and sent you that just saying I am the OC and you're the corporate debtor. And that should be enough. Then NCLAT became involved in this entire exercise of whether if a demand notice is not sent as the prescribed form 3, but in the alternative form 4, should it be allowed? Because technically the code provides for that format. So as long as the code provides for a separate format, it should be allowed. But the ultimate conclusion that NCLAT reached was that whether you send demand notice in form 3 or you send it in form 4 which doesn't require those many documents, depends on the nature of the debt owed and not the discretion of the said operational creditor. They say, for example, in transactions where goods and services are provided and money is owed, you most necessarily have to provide invoices and purchase orders. So since operational creditors are people who render goods, services, employees and workmen, for employees and workmen perhaps a form 3 demand notice may not be required because there's no question of purchase orders, invoices and relevant documentation. Those they still make it in form 3 if they have to. But for these type of creditors where there's an ongoing contractual transaction with the day-to-day dealing, you must provide relevant documentation, which was absent in the case of CloudWalker. And just because the code provides for an alternative form, you have to see what form applies to your situation best. Form 3, therefore, whether or not form 3 has to be sent by an operational creditor depends on the nature of debt and not the creditor. That was one part. Now, what had happened was that amidst this dispute, CloudWalker had sometimes sent an arbitration notice to Flipkart saying, pursuant to our agreement and all the misunderstandings that have arisen, let's arbitrate. But it had subsequently gone and withdrawn that notice. That withdrawal to say that there is no dispute. Flipkart, I also was fortunate enough to see the arguments on my own. In this case, and Flipkart very astutely argued that just because the notice of dispute was withdrawn doesn't mean that there was no pre-existing dispute. And if you look at the paragraphs in the later half of the judgment, Justice Mukhopadhyay has said, Justice Venugopal has said just that. Withdrawal of a notice of dispute doesn't eliminate the dispute. In fact, that's evidence that a dispute existed in the first place. Keeping into account these two crucial factors, that one, CloudWalker was not able to prove that debt was payable in due, in fact and in law, and the fact that there was pre-existing dispute, irrespective of whether the notice was withdrawn or not. The insolvency petition against Flipkart was set aside, and Flipkart was a free person again. My favorite thing about IBC is that the foreign banks and financial institutions have been permitted to apply. The problem with SARFAESI and RDB Act, Recovery of Debts Act, was that it defined banks and financial institutions very restrictively. And while the SARFAESI had made a particular provision for the International Finance Corporation, which is the banking arm of the World Bank, there were no other provisions for foreign financial creditor to apply. Thankfully, now pursuant to the code, foreign creditors, operational or financial, can make proceedings. The question then again becomes, there are certain aspects of the form for both FCs and OCs which are very peculiar to the Indian jurisdiction. For example, I think I recall mentioning the Bankers Book Evidence Act, which talks about you to give a certificate from a bank which says that, okay, there are debts due and payable to X and YZ bank. This is applicable in the case of a financial creditor. Similarly, an OC will have to obtain a certificate from a bank saying no debts received by this person and debts are owed to the said OC. But foreign banks will not be able to procure these certificates. So one such case, which was landmark, was the Macquarie Bank versus Shilpi Cables. I don't know if people know Macquarie is a company and bank based in Australia, having branches across the world. NALSA used to even have an exchange to Macquarie University in Australia. Not sure if it still does. But yeah, Macquarie Bank, Singapore branch wanted to file against the corporate debtor. They filed a Section 9. They filed a Section 9 notice because the debt was OC and it got transferred. The question was whether the particular certificate, under the particular certificate that certifies that I have not received any amount from the said creditor, since they were not able to receive the same, would that application be fatal? NCLT dismissed the application, went up to NCLAT. NCLAT also said that no, they should be able to provide the certification. In the absence of that, they're not even actually a bank or financial institution under the code. Macquarie Bank went to Supreme Court. Supreme Court was very clear. There's no express bar under the code. Somebody has asked me, has there been any appeal in the Flipkart case to the Supreme Court? No, there's been no appeal listed so far. Plus, I would say wait for it, because the Supreme Court this is a February decision or the late January decision, and they have a 60-day period, I think, 45-day period to approach, 30-day period to approach the Supreme Court, which may be allowed with a condemnation of delay. Plus, COVID started on March 15th, which has excluded the limitation for these. So they may be, though I think there was pretty clearly a dispute found, and their chances of them applying and of filing and winning are slim. I hope that answers the question. Anyway, all right. So Supreme Court said in respect of Macquarie Bank two things: no bar against financial creditor, foreign financial creditors and foreign operation creditors applying. Elements of the application which are very peculiar to Indian jurisdiction are not mandatory for such foreign creditors. There's another interesting litigation that I was a part of when I was doing IBC litigation there in previous employment. Was this ICICI Bank UK PLC? ICICI Bank UK PLC was a foreign bank, naturally located in London, and they wanted to file because the debt owed by their Indian subsidiary had been guaranteed to them. It was a complex debt structure. Eventually, the outcome was ICICI Bank UK was owed certain monies by a Delhi-based company by way of a property. As in, they had said that if ICICI Bank's loans are not cleared off, we sell the property to service your loan. While we were appearing for ICICI Bank UK PLC, while they made the submissions, one of the things they said was that we had not attached the Bankers Book of Evidence Act. NCLT was very quick to reject their submission, and obviously we also made contrary submissions in our written submission, that they looked at Macquarie, and there was another case called Sunrise A14 versus Denmark, Sunrise A14 Denmark versus something else, where Dutch financial creditor had made an application which was rejected and eventually went up to Supreme Court. And Supreme Court said, looking at Macquarie, which was in respect of operational debt, we will hold the same thing in respect of financial debt and say the financial creditors do not have to meet the requirement, foreign financial creditors do not have to meet the requirements of the application to the T, provided they meet the larger material requirements. Right. Moving on. Now, all of this knowledge is great, but won't help if you don't know how to advise your client, knowing the intricacies of IBC and the ensuing litigation. Now, if your client is an OC, the kind of advice you would give them would be, please ensure you have all the purchase orders, all the invoice. If somebody is disputing a claim, which is what a corporate debtor should be advised to do, to dispute the claim at the outset. You ensure that you say there is no dispute in this. You are owed X. We were supposed to be paid by Y date. Give us the money. It's important because OC debt gets thrown out like this if there's a dispute. It's incumbent on the lawyer of an operational creditor to tell them that you ensure that you maintain absolutely clear records and dispute a dispute from the very beginning. And if possible, procure an acknowledgement of liability. That's easier to do if you're a financial creditor. Generally, banks and financial institutions, their loan documents say that they will do something called a revival letter. For bank term loans, for example, which are given by banks, are given for a long period of time. Say one given 2010 and will be for 10 years, 20 years, 21 years. In such a case, it's best to get an acknowledgement from the debtor saying, I was owed this money, it was supposed to be paid, say by X date. I have not paid it. I acknowledge that I am still under liability. These revival letters will help you fight off any limitation claims, which are becoming greater and greater in IBC now. So as an advisor to both FCs and OCs, you will say, please ensure that you have proper documentation. Please procure an acknowledgement of liability from the operational creditor and or get a revival letter saying my debt was barred, but would have been barred by time, but I acknowledge that it's still alive and kicking and was supposed to be paid by me and has not been paid. These are relatively easier to advise in my personal experience. Banks have become very, very, very astute in handling IBC litigation. ICICI being one of such banks. They cover all the bases, they maintain proper documentation, there's not much of a problem. The problem comes when you have to say, advise a corporate debtor. If you're advising corporate debtor against who's like a contractor or deals in goods and services, and or people who are just running a regular company and who feel that they may face claims from their employees, the best thing you can ask them to do is generate correspondence that evidences dispute. If somebody says, I think you owe me this money, immediately send them an email saying, no, you do not owe us this money. Now, since correspondence is enough to prove pre-existing dispute, your first advice to your client perhaps should be to say, there is no dispute. To say that you say that there is no dispute. And specifically, if you're advising your corporate debtor, you ensure you advise them to respond to the demand notice, if any served on them. Because a large part of the time, what happens is if a corporate debtor does not respond to the demand notice within the 10-day time period, court later see it as an admission of liability or your lax attitude towards the loans taken by you. So in such a case, it's best to advise your client to prepare an effective response to demand notice, ensure absolutely crisp correspondence on no dispute, and maintenance of all documentation goes both ways, whether you're advising an OC or you're advising a corporate debtor. Now, okay, I've told you what all goes in your favor when you're applying as an OC or an FC, but how do you defend a corporate debtor when, say, an application is being made for financial creditors? As I said, if a financial creditor has made an application and unless there's fraud or there's debt not payable in fact or in law, you can pretty much assume that a client is doomed. IBC is more than slightly one-sided in terms of its treatment of FC applications, and they get allowed with much ease. You can perhaps try and show that there has been the initiation of CI process has been for oblique motives as opposed to actual resolution of the debts of a corporate debtor. I recently saw an NCLAT case in January where SBI had initiated an application. SBI or some other mainstream bank, I'm not sure. I don't wish to be saying any bank. A mainstream bank had filed an application for CI process. The corporate debtor was offering it a settlement proceeding. You know what? Let's settle. We owe you X, but we'll give you some X minus 10 amounts and let's get done. And that mainstream bank wasn't ready to settle and was still insistent on CI process application. In such a case, NCLAT held that it looks like you are initiating CI process. just to initiate CR process and obtain a higher recovery without having any element of resolution of debts, and had held it to be a fraudulent initiation. Under the IBC, fraudulent initiation of CR process is met with a penalty varying between 1 lakh to 1 crore. I may want to caution you here. CI process saying that CI process initiation happened for fraudulent reasons is a very tough ground to prove. And NCLAT has held that unless from the prima facie record you can tell that it is fraudulent, it's going to be tough to prove. Today, in fact, Bar and Bench highlighted a case where there was some issue in a Section 7 financial creditor application where the corporate debtor was saying that there is some forgery with respect to the signatures involved in the loan documentation, and NCLT Mumbai had ordered an audit, independent audit into the documentation forgery. Under the IBC, if you forge documents, you are met with the criminal liability under Section 75. And went up to NCLAT, where NCLAT was like, this is a Section 7 application. There was no need to order an independent audit. All you had to see was whether there's debt and default and threshold of 1 crore is met. And since that's met, there is no need to go into independent audit of whether there was forgery or not. Just go and admit the application, and has remanded this matter back to NCLT Mumbai. So you can see that the threshold, say, financial creditors it's very high. It's very high to dispute a financial creditor application is made against your client. As I said, limitation is perhaps one ground, but as I said, most financial creditors will keep a revival letter in check to keep you in check. OCs, there's some play involved. You can perhaps use prior correspondence to show a pre-existing dispute. Can question the form and content of demand notice, so that will buy you time and not buy you much more. You can claim fraudulent initiation, but the rules applicable are same. Though for operational creditors, sometimes people file against operational creditors only to wriggle out money, because they know in the ultimate scheme of things, they don't even get to sit on the COC, and they will fall way below in the waterfall in liquidation. So generally, the initiation of CIRP, there's much more room to play with in case of operational creditors. Also, if you're able to show that there's some gray area as to why this was initiated and there's some dispute, you can get the application thrown out. Right. Now, suppose you've been able to cross all these hurdles, your application gets getting heard. You're an OC or an FC. You would want to consider this question of interim orders. Interim orders refers to orders that are given prior to a final order. So any order given between the first hearing and the last hearing are interim orders. The orders I'm referring to are the orders that you receive at the very beginning. That is, you fight for certain orders which will protect your client until the end of your litigation. In a normal adversarial litigation, which is not before a summary jurisdiction like the NCLT, perhaps you would ask for a stay. You would ask for certain properties to be set aside, certain amount to be kept in a separate bank account. So you would ask for these things. Sorry. But in NCLT, I have seen very few interim orders being given, though COVID has changed that completely, because now, since full-fledged hearings are not being held, NCLTs are more inclined to grant, say, an interim order to protect one party. What does it grant interim orders under? It grants it under Rule 11. When I remember doing the mood with you guys, and there was some lack of in the selection mood, and there was some lack of clarity as to the application of Rule 11. The principle that Rule 11 powers are not available to a jurisdiction, to NCLT under the IBC jurisdiction, is wrong. That was an old law. That was the old position. The new position post precedence is that they have inherent powers under the Rule 11, and they have inherent powers to prevent the abuse of justice and to protect the interests of the party. So there was this case called Nui Pulp and Paper Industries versus Rockcell Trading, which went before the NCLT Chennai. The operational creditor had filed an application. They also said that they've heard, as in they have this apprehension that the corporate debtor is trying to sell away its property and that's why it's taking hearing after hearing. And they file an application under Section 60, subclause 5, to obtain interim orders against the corporate debtor to prevent it from selling off or alienating its property. Now, it was challenged by the person arguing on behalf of the corporate debtor that NCLT does not have power under the insolvency regime to issue such interim orders. So after that, the NCLT agreed, and then they went off to NCLAT. NCLAT read Rule 11 into this and said that, one, they have the powers to do justice and to prevent abuse of process. Moratorium, therefore, against the property in a way can be initiated prior to even CIR process initiation. And the factors that laid heavily in favor of this interim order was that, one, the corporate debtor was not saying that it does not intend to sell its property. And it was not even giving a reply as to what the particulars of the apprehension. When there was no response as to if the apprehension filed by the operational creditor that the property would be sold off is real or not, and it was not saying that, okay, I will not sell off my property, NCLT imposed interim orders. I have seen subsequent decisions pursuant to this NCLAT decision. This Movipal, by the way, went to Supreme Court, and Supreme Court refused to entertain any such appeal. So NCLAT order stands as the final law on this. I have seen further decisions following NCLAT by like NCLT decisions, and they seem to be property related. Here's my take on it. I understand why interim orders are given to protect property, because property and security will form an essential part in resolution of debts and eventual dissolution or liquidation, if any. I don't think any other kind of interim order should be given or protects the interests of justice. For example, if I approach the NCLT and saying, ask this person, I feel that he will not be able to pay me back money until the insolvency resolution happens. You should ask him to keep this X money that he supposedly owes me in a bank account separate. I don't think something like this should be allowed. One, it is prejudicial to any other creditor, because say if as an operational creditor, I file an application, at the end of it, I will get only X amount of due in the waterfall or in the hierarchy. I can't ask for a certain amount to be kept aside, which would have been put to use of the other creditors in the waterfall. Secondly, the ultimate aim of the court is to keep the business of the corporate debtor running as a going concern. Now, if I ask for certain amounts to be kept away for a company that's probably going to face insolvency, that is going to hinder its running as a going concern. So this is my take on why interim orders should be limited only to absolutely protecting the property and the assets of the corporate debtor, but that's about it. All right. Would you want to pause here, because I want to know if any last 10 minutes should be kept for questions, because not everybody asks questions. If not, I will continue. I can do another 10 minutes as well. I have enough material. Tilak? Right.
Yes, ma'am. There are a few questions, I think, and in chat as well.
Somebody, okay. Hey, so the definition of financial debts includes any amount raised pursuant to issuance of debentures. But what about compulsory convertible debentures? Can CCDs be treated equity and hence not financial debt for the purposes of IBC? Depends on the terms and conditions. So CCDs also will have their conditions, right, as to what is the trigger point for the for them to be considered as equity or debt. So it depends on that particular contractual provision. But I do think debentures can largely be treated as debt and not equity. Also, for instruments such as CCDs, complex debt instruments, I have seen, at least in the LaFin case, I will answer. In the LaFin case, complex debt instruments which will have the effect of borrowing will perhaps sway a judge more in favor of holding it as a financial debt. I don't know what particular conditions you're asking for, and I have not seen a CCD case being taken, so I can't answer your question conclusively. Isn't CCD treated as debt as per Neelkant Township order? One second, let me unmute this. Yeah, 1 second. Yeah, Aditya, ask your question. Hello, Aditya. Aditya, I'm unmuted you so you can talk.
Hello. Can
Yeah.
you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. No, so I think I was doing some research, I think, about in 2018, which had to do with this Neelkant Township judgment of the, I think it was the NCLT Delhi.
I think Neelkant Township was
Yeah, correct. Um, and um, and so there it was said that even though the debt might not have crystallized, because of it becoming due and payable at some point in the future, it would still be treated as debt.
That's why I said no complex debt structures eventually will be considered as debt. Though I may caution you, Neelkant is a fairly old order. And the contours of what is debt has changed. Though I'll be honest with you, after seeing Pioneer, Pioneer and what they interpreting debt as a loose concept, I agree with you. Neelkant, the certain elements of fibers of Neelkant have made their way through Pioneer, and that is being seen expansively. As I said, the Laughing case, which has not been explained properly by the Supreme Court, but much better by NCLAT, that also assist you. And debt structures generally, there's a good argument to be made that they are financial debt. Okay. Anybody else? Wow. I feel it, man. Okay, Ashna has. Yeah, Ashna, go.
There's a case itself, no, from January that laid down. I think NCLT Delhi itself. It was SGM WebTech that said that fully and compulsory convertible debentures are debt as until and unless when the application is put before the NCLT for insolvency, if they haven't been converted to equity yet, it will still count as financial debt.
That's great then.
Yeah. So it's
so
a
separate debt structures mostly will be considered financial creditor or financial debt unless they have a specific stipulation, unless they have a specific stipulation as to when they can be considered equity, which is what I think the case was about.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Right. Why would an OC go for CRP when he's so low in the waterfall rather than going for SRA or such other? SRA, can this anonymous SRA, do you mean S4A or do you mean Specific Relief Act? Or do you mean the S4A or SRA under the RBI mechanism? Can whoever is this anonymous attendee ask this question otherwise? Right. Can you not have discussion on chat board right now? It's kind of distracting. Sorry. All right. Why would an OC go to CRP very so low in the waterfall? That's precisely what I'm trying to tell you. Mostly for OCs, it's generally a modus to arm twist your corporate debtor into payments. It logically makes no sense when they appear for the NCLT. NCLTs also tell them this exact same thing, where you're asked to settle more often than not. OCs are asked to settle more often than not, and then they use IBC to get a higher value for what they've received, basically. Somebody is saying, I did not understand why foreign companies are exempt from providing a certificate. Foreign banking institutions are exempt from providing a certificate, which is the banker's book certificate, because that can only be obtained by banks and financial institutions under India. That's why. Guys, can you please have like a discussion separately? I'm not around in answer. Please do it on your own time. It's very distracting. All right. Is there any other question? I think I've answered all of these in the Q&A box. If you want to ask them, Otherwise, all right. Anything else? Tilak, is there any other question?
No, ma'am, I don't think so.
No, somebody asked me something regarding subrogation last week. I wasn't able to answer. As the person here, I can if you can elaborate on your question in person, I'll be able to answer better. I didn't understand what you typed. Sorry.
So if anybody wants to ask question, he or she can raise hand and then we can unmute.
Yeah. I think we are good.
Yes, ma'am.
One second, I'm also looking at the chat if there's any question. Also, by the way, Boulevard projects went into NCLAT, so you may want to check the status of that. Though I broadly agree with that should be the understanding, right? Anything is debt until specific terms of the contract make it equity. And the ventures are more debt in terms of the structuring of the instrument as opposed to equity. So the SGM WebTech case, the Boulevard, I think Boulevard projects has gone into NCLAT and or Supreme Court, I'm not sure. So you may want to check on that, but I do think largely the principle is right. All right, if that's about it, I'll see you guys tomorrow. Tilak, what time tomorrow?
Ma'am, 11 a.m.
Yeah, cool. Sounds good.
Okay, ma'am. We'll see you tomorrow at 11.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.